Margaret hated her new neighbor Sarah and her baby Emma. She couldn't stand seeing them happy. One night, Margaret broke into their house and put poison in the baby's milk. She wanted to hurt them badly. But she didn't know Emma's father was a police officer who would catch her. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maple Grove. Birds chirped peacefully in the oak trees, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers. But beneath this perfect facade, hatred was brewing in the heart of Margaret Thompson, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. Margaret stood at her pristine kitchen window, her cold gray eyes fixed on the house across the street. Her manicured fingers gripped her coffee mug so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The source of her rage was a simple sight that most people would find heartwarming: a young mother sitting on her front porch, gently rocking her 6-month-old baby in her arms. "That woman," Margaret muttered through clenched teeth, "thinks she can just waltz into our perfect neighborhood and ruin everything." The woman she was glaring at was Sarah Martinez, a 24-year-old single mother who had moved into the neighborhood just 3 months ago. Sarah had bought the small house with her life savings, hoping to give her baby daughter, Emma, a safe place to grow up. She worked double shifts at the local hospital as a nurse, coming home exhausted but always finding energy to smile at her precious little girl. But Margaret saw Sarah differently. To her, Sarah represented everything wrong with their community. A young, unmarried mother with a mixed-race baby, driving an old car, and worst of all, happy despite not meeting Margaret's standards of what a proper neighbor should be. The conflict had started small. Margaret had left passive-aggressive notes about Sarah's slightly overgrown lawn. Then came complaints about Emma's crying during the day, even though babies naturally cry. Margaret had even called the HOA board multiple times, trying to find violations in Sarah's perfectly acceptable behavior. "She's bringing down our property values," Margaret had declared at the last HOA meeting, her voice dripping with barely concealed racism. "That type of person doesn't belong in Maple Grove." But Sarah had done nothing wrong. She kept her house clean, paid her dues on time, and was always polite to her neighbors. Most of the community actually liked her. She would wave cheerfully at everyone, offer to help elderly neighbors with their groceries, and her bright smile could light up anyone's day. This only made Margaret angrier. How dare this woman be happy? How dare she fit in so well when Margaret had worked so hard to maintain the neighborhood's standards? The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was returning from her morning jog when she saw Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. Sarah stepped out, looking exhausted after her night shift at the hospital. She moved slowly, her shoulders sagging with fatigue, but she still managed to smile when she saw Margaret. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah called out warmly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret didn't respond. She just stared with cold hatred as Sarah carefully lifted her baby carrier from the car. Little Emma was sleeping peacefully, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Sarah's face softened with pure love as she looked at her daughter. "Sleep well, my little angel," Sarah whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to Emma's forehead. Something inside Margaret snapped. The sight of such pure, unconditional love filled her with a rage she had never felt before. This happiness, this contentment, it was everything Margaret had never had. At 52 she was alone, bitter and miserable. Her own children had moved across the country to escape her toxicity, and her husband had left her years ago. As Sarah disappeared into her house, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would make Sarah pay for daring to be happy in her neighborhood. That evening, Margaret watched from her window as Sarah prepared for another night shift. She saw Sarah's routine warming Emma's bottles, setting them in the refrigerator, and giving detailed instructions to Mrs. Chin, the elderly babysitter who watched Emma during Sarah's night shifts. Margaret's twisted mind began forming a plan. She knew Sarah's schedule by heart. She knew about the spare key hidden under the garden gnome. She knew exactly how to hurt Sarah in the most devastating way possible. The next night, Margaret waited until Sarah left for work and Mrs. Chin settled into her usual spot on the couch, watching her evening shows. Margaret had seen this routine dozens of times. Mrs. Chin always fell asleep around 10 p.m., and Sarah wouldn't return until 6 a.m. At 11 p.m., Margaret crept across the street like a shadow. Her heart pounded with adrenaline and malice. She retrieved the spare key and silently entered Sarah's home. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of Mrs. Chen's snoring from the living room. Margaret made her way to the kitchen, where she found Emma's prepared bottles in the refrigerator. Her hands shook as she pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her purse. The label clearly read, 70% alcohol, for external use only. For a moment Margaret hesitated. She looked at the innocent baby bottles, each one prepared with such care and love. But her hatred burned stronger than any conscience she might have had left. With deliberate cruelty, Margaret opened the first bottle and squeezed a generous amount of hand sanitizer into the milk. She mixed it carefully, making sure it was undetectable. Then she did the same to the second bottle. And the third. As she worked, Margaret imagined Sarah's face when she discovered what had happened. She pictured the chaos, the panic, the devastation. Sarah would finally understand what it felt like to have her perfect little world destroyed. Margaret replaced the bottles in the refrigerator and slipped out of the house as silently as she had entered. She returned to her own home, went to bed, and slept better than she had in months. The next morning started like any other. Sarah returned from her shift at 6:30 a.m., exhausted but eager to see her daughter. She found Mrs. Chen preparing to leave and Emma just beginning to wake up. "She was an angel all night," Mrs. Chen reported with a warm smile. "Slept through until about an hour ago." Sarah paid Mrs. Chen and thanked her, then scooped Emma into her arms. "Good morning, my beautiful girl," she whispered, breathing in that sweet baby scent that melted her heart every time. Emma gurgled happily, her tiny hands reaching for her mother's face. Sarah's exhaustion melted away as she gazed into those bright, innocent eyes. This was what made all the long hours and struggles worth it. After changing Emma's diaper, Sarah went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She pulled out one of the bottles from the refrigerator, the same bottle that Margaret had poisoned just hours earlier. The milk looked normal, smelled normal. Sarah had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. She warmed the bottle carefully, testing the temperature on her wrist as she always did. Everything seemed fine. Emma was getting fussy, making those small hungry sounds that Sarah knew meant it was time to eat. Sarah settled into the rocking chair by the window, the same chair where she fed Emma every morning. The sun was streaming through the curtains, and Emma looked up at her mother with complete trust and love. "Here we go, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, offering the bottle to Emma. Emma latched on immediately, her tiny hands grasping the bottle as she drank. Sarah smiled, stroking her daughter's soft hair and humming a gentle lullaby. These quiet moments were the most precious part of her day. But within minutes something was wrong. Emma began to cough and sputter, milk dribbling from her mouth. Her little face started to turn red and she began crying, not her usual hungry cry, but a distressed, painful sound that made Sarah's heart race. "What's wrong, baby?" Sarah asked, pulling the bottle away and sitting Emma up to pat her back. But Emma's crying intensified. She was arching her back, her tiny fists clenched, and her breathing seemed labored. Sarah's nursing training kicked in immediately. This wasn't normal fussiness. Something was seriously wrong. Sarah grabbed her phone and called 911, her hands shaking as she held Emma, who was now crying inconsolably and showing signs of distress that terrified her mother. 911, what's your emergency? My baby, something's wrong with my baby, Sarah gasped, her voice breaking. She was drinking her bottle and now she's having trouble breathing and won't stop crying. Please, I need an ambulance. Stay calm, ma'am. An ambulance is on the way. Can you tell me what happened? Sarah described Emma's symptoms while trying to keep her voice steady. Every second felt like an eternity as she watched her daughter suffer. The baby's cries were getting weaker, which somehow made it even more frightening. The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed quickly by police officers. As they worked on Emma, one of the officers began asking Sarah questions about what had happened. Sarah told them about the feeding, about how normal everything had seemed until Emma started having problems. "Ma'am, we need to take the bottle and any remaining milk for testing," the officer explained. "This could be accidental poisoning, but we need to rule out all possibilities." The word poisoning hit Sarah like a physical blow. Poisoning? How could she be poisoned? I made the bottle myself last night. I always do everything the same way. At the hospital, Sarah paced the waiting room while doctors worked on Emma. The baby had been rushed into the emergency room, and Sarah hadn't been allowed to go with her. She was alone, terrified, and desperate for any news about her daughter's condition. Dr. Williams, the pediatric emergency physician, finally emerged from the treatment room. His face was grave as he approached Sarah. "Mrs. Martinez, your daughter is stable for now, but I need to ask you some questions. The preliminary tests show that Emma has ingested a significant amount of alcohol. Can you explain how this might have happened?" Sarah's legs gave out and she collapsed into a chair. "Alcohol? That's impossible. I don't drink, I never have alcohol in the house. I made her bottle exactly like I always do." The concentration suggests this was isopropyl alcohol, like what's found in hand sanitizer. Are you certain no one else had access to the bottles? The realization hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. Someone had deliberately poisoned her baby. Someone had entered her home and contaminated Emma's milk with the intent to harm an innocent child. The thought made her physically sick. Who could hate a 6-month-old baby so much that they would try to poison her? Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. She thought of every person who knew her routine, every neighbor who had seen her coming and going. The spare key under the garden gnome, she had mentioned it to several neighbors in casual conversation, thinking she was being friendly and open. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Someone wanted to hurt my baby. Someone actually wanted to hurt Emma." The nurse sitting beside her tried to offer comfort, but Sarah was beyond consolation. Her world had shattered completely. The safe neighborhood she had chosen for her daughter, the community she had tried so hard to fit into, it had turned into a nightmare. "I need to call the police," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Someone did this on purpose. Someone tried to kill my baby." Dr. Williams nodded gravely. "We've already contacted the authorities. Detective Morrison is on his way. Sarah, I want you to know that Emma is going to be okay. She's strong and we caught this early. But I need you to think carefully about anyone who might have had access to your home." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the horror of what had happened. Someone had stood in her kitchen, had held Emma's bottles in their hands, and had deliberately contaminated them with poison. The violation felt almost as devastating as the physical harm to her daughter. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at the hospital within the hour. He was a 15-year veteran of the police force, a man who had seen the worst of humanity but still believed in justice. More importantly, though Sarah had never told anyone in the neighborhood, Ray was Emma's father. Their relationship had been complicated from the start. Sarah and Ray had met at a coffee shop 2 years ago, both dealing with personal struggles. Sarah was working her way through nursing school while supporting herself, and Ray was going through a difficult divorce. They had found comfort in each other during those challenging months. Their romance had been brief but meaningful. They had both realized that while they cared deeply for each other, they weren't meant to be life partners. The breakup had been amicable, with both agreeing to remain friends. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, she had been terrified to tell Ray, afraid he might think she was trying to trap him. But Ray had surprised her. Despite their romantic relationship being over, he had immediately stepped up as a father. He had supported Sarah throughout her pregnancy, attended doctor's appointments, and had been there for Emma's birth. He loved his daughter with a fierce intensity that sometimes scared him. The one thing they had agreed on was keeping their relationship private. Ray's job often put him in dangerous situations, and they both felt it was safer if his connection to Sarah and Emma wasn't public knowledge. In the small suburban community, Sarah was known as a single mother, and Ray was simply the local detective who sometimes checked on the neighborhood. When Ray received the call that Emma was in the hospital, his professional training had warred with his paternal panic. He had been in the middle of questioning a suspect when his phone rang. The moment he heard Emma and hospital in the same sentence, everything else had ceased to matter. Ray had left the interrogation room so abruptly that his partner had followed him, concerned. "Morrison, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "My daughter," Ray had said, his voice barely controlled. "Someone hurt my daughter." Now, as he walked through the hospital corridors toward the emergency room, Ray felt a cold rage building inside him. Someone had targeted his child. Someone had entered Sarah's home with the deliberate intent to harm an innocent baby. As a police officer, he had sworn to protect and serve. As a father, he had sworn to protect Emma above all else. When he saw Sarah in the waiting room, tears streaming down her face and her whole body shaking with shock, something inside him broke. She looked so small, so vulnerable, so completely devastated. Ray had comforted many victims' families in his 15 years on the force, but this was different. This was the mother of his child, and she was suffering because someone had tried to murder their baby. When he saw Sarah in the waiting room, tears streaming down her face, something inside him broke. Sarah looked up and saw him approaching, and the relief in her eyes was overwhelming. "Ray," she whispered, standing up on shaky legs. "Someone poisoned her. Someone actually poisoned our baby." Ray pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her tightly as she broke down completely. He had comforted many victims' families in his career, but this was different. This was his daughter, his own flesh and blood, and someone had deliberately tried to hurt her. "I'm going to find out who did this," Ray said, his voice low and dangerous. "I promise you, Sarah. Whoever did this will pay." Dr. Williams updated them on Emma's condition. The baby was responding well to treatment, but she would need to stay in the hospital for observation. The alcohol had caused significant distress to her system, and while the doctors were optimistic, the next 24 hours would be critical. The investigation consumed Ray completely. He worked 18-hour days, following every lead, interviewing every neighbor, analyzing every piece of evidence. His captain had suggested he recuse himself from the case due to his personal involvement, but Ray had convinced him that his intimate knowledge of the family's routine made him the best detective for the job. What Ray didn't tell his captain was that this case had become personal in a way that transcended professional duty. Every time he looked at Emma in her hospital bed, so small and vulnerable with tubes and wires attached to her tiny body, he felt a rage so pure and focused that it frightened him. The forensics team worked around the clock processing Sarah's house. They dusted for fingerprints, collected DNA samples, and analyzed every surface that the perpetrator might have touched. Ray supervised every step of the process, his trained eye catching details that others might miss. "Detective," the lead forensics technician called out from the kitchen. "We've got something interesting here." Ray approached the refrigerator, where the technician was using a special light to reveal fingerprint patterns. "See this smudge on the handle? It's not Sarah's prints and it's not the babysitter's. Someone else opened this refrigerator recently." Ray felt his pulse quicken. "Can you get a clear enough print for identification?" "I think so. Give me a few more minutes." While the forensics team worked, Ray walked through the house, trying to see it through the perpetrator's eyes. They had known about the spare key, which meant they had been watching the house carefully. They had known Sarah's work schedule and Mrs. Chen's routine. This wasn't a random crime, it was targeted, planned, and personal. In Emma's nursery, Ray stood beside the crib where his daughter should have been sleeping safely. Instead, she was fighting for her life in a hospital because someone's hatred had driven them to poison an innocent child. The walls were painted a soft yellow with hand-painted flowers that Sarah had done herself during her pregnancy. There were photos of Emma's first months of life, each one showing a healthy, happy baby surrounded by love. Ray picked up one of Emma's stuffed animals, a small elephant that he had given her when she was born. He held it gently, remembering the day he had first held his daughter, the overwhelming love and protectiveness he had felt. Someone had tried to take that away from him, had tried to take Emma away forever. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dr. Williams says Emma is responding better to treatment. They think she'll be able to come home tomorrow." Ray felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Emma was going to be okay. Now he needed to make sure that whoever had done this would pay for their crime. The forensics team called him back to the kitchen. "We've got clear prints, detective. Running them through the database now." Ray watched as the technician uploaded the fingerprint data to the police database. Within minutes they had a match. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully," Ray said as they sat beside Emma's hospital bed. "Who knows about your routine? Who would know when you're at work and when Mrs. Chen babysits?" Sarah's face was pale as she watched Emma sleep, tiny tubes and wires attached to her small body. "Most of the neighbors, I suppose. I've lived there for 3 months. People see me leaving for work, coming home. Anyone who's shown particular interest in your schedule? Anyone who's been unfriendly or made comments?" Sarah's eyes slowly filled with understanding and fury. Margaret Thompson's name appeared on the screen, along with her address and previous arrest records. Ray stared at the information, his jaw clenching as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Margaret had been arrested twice for harassment and once for trespassing, all involving disputes with neighbors. "That's our perpetrator," Ray said grimly. Margaret Thompson, 52, lives across the street from the victim. The forensics technician looked up from his equipment. "Detective, we also found traces of hand sanitizer on the bottle caps that matched the brand found in the baby's milk. Same lot number and everything." Ray felt the case solidifying around Margaret like a noose. She had left a trail of evidence that would be impossible to explain away. But before he arrested her, he wanted to understand why she had done this. What could drive someone to poison an innocent baby? Ray spent the next several hours researching Margaret's background. What he found painted a picture of a deeply disturbed woman whose life had been a series of failures and disappointments. Her husband had divorced her 5 years ago, citing her increasingly erratic and controlling behavior. Her 2 adult children had moved across the country and rarely spoke to her. Margaret had no criminal history involving violence, but there was a pattern of escalating conflicts with neighbors. She had filed dozens of complaints with the HOA, the police and city officials about various neighbors over the years. Most were dismissed as frivolous, but they showed a woman obsessed with control and unable to tolerate any deviation from her narrow vision of how things should be. The most disturbing part of Margaret's history was a series of anonymous complaints she had filed with Child Protective Services against various families in the neighborhood. None of the complaints had been substantiated, but they showed a willingness to use the system to attack families she disliked. Ray closed the file and rubbed his eyes. He had seen plenty of evil in his career, but this felt different. This was evil disguised as righteousness, hatred masquerading as concern for community standards. Margaret had convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood when in reality, she was the greatest threat it had ever faced. That evening, Ray sat beside Emma's hospital bed while Sarah slept in the chair beside him. Emma was breathing easier now, her color had returned to normal, and the doctors were optimistic about her full recovery. But Ray couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing her. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered to his sleeping daughter. "Daddy should have protected you better. I should have seen the danger." Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around Ray's finger. The gesture was so trusting, so innocent, that it brought tears to his eyes. She had no idea that someone had tried to hurt her, no understanding of the hatred that had motivated the attack. To Emma, the world was still a place of love and safety because that's all she had ever known. Ray made a silent promise to his daughter that night. He would make sure she grew up in a world where she never had to face that kind of hatred again. And he would make sure that Margaret Thompson paid for what she had done. "Tell me everything," Ray said, pulling out his notebook. Sarah recounted months of increasingly hostile behavior from Margaret. The notes, the complaints, the cold stares, the comments about property values, and people who don't belong. As Sarah talked, Ray felt his anger building. He had dealt with plenty of racism in his career, but this was personal. This woman had targeted his daughter because she couldn't stand the sight of a happy, mixed-race family. The next morning, Ray stood on Margaret's doorstep at 7 a.m. He was in full uniform, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. When Margaret opened the door, she was clearly surprised to see a police officer. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Detective Morrison. I need to speak with you about the incident at the Martinez residence." Margaret's face went pale, but she quickly composed herself. "I don't know what you're talking about." "What incident?" "Someone poisoned Sarah Martinez's baby yesterday. I'm investigating attempted murder." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She hadn't intended to kill the baby, she had just wanted to make Sarah suffer. But as she looked at the tall, imposing officer standing on her doorstep, she realized the gravity of what she had done. I don't know anything about that," Margaret stammered. "Why would you think I'd know anything?" "Because you've been harassing Ms. Martinez for months. Because you have access to her property. Because you've made it clear that you want her family out of this neighborhood." Margaret's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, to not admit anything. "I may have had some disagreements with Ms. Martinez about HOA policies, but I would never hurt anyone." Ray studied her face carefully. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she avoided looking directly at him. "Mrs. Thompson, a 6-month-old baby is in the hospital fighting for her life because someone put hand sanitizer in her milk. That someone had to have access to the house and knowledge of the family's routine. That someone wanted to cause serious harm to an innocent child." "That's terrible," Margaret said, trying to sound shocked. "I hope you catch whoever did such a horrible thing." "I will," Ray replied, his voice cold and determined. "And when I do, they'll face charges for attempted murder, breaking and entering, and endangering the welfare of a child. The evidence will tell us exactly who did this." After Ray left, Margaret began to panic. She hadn't considered that the police would test the milk, that they would find traces of the hand sanitizer. She hadn't thought about fingerprints or DNA evidence. She had acted out of pure hatred without considering the consequences. That afternoon, the forensics results came back. The hand sanitizer found in Emma's milk was a specific brand, the same brand that Margaret had in her purse. More importantly, trace amounts of Margaret's DNA were found on the bottle caps, and her fingerprints were on the refrigerator handle. Ray felt a cold satisfaction as he read the report. He had the evidence he needed to arrest the woman who had poisoned his daughter. But first he wanted to see Emma. At the hospital, Sarah was holding Emma for the first time since the poisoning. The baby was awake and alert, her eyes bright as she looked up at her mother. The doctors had said she would make a full recovery, but the trauma of those first few hours would stay with Sarah forever. "She's going to be okay," Dr. Williams told Ray as he entered the room. "She's a fighter just like her parents." Ray approached the bed carefully, his heart breaking at the sight of his daughter with medical equipment still attached to her tiny body. Sarah looked up at him with exhausted but grateful eyes. The tests came back, Ray said quietly. We have enough evidence to make an arrest. Sarah nodded, her jaw set with determination. Good. I want her to pay for what she did to Emma. Ray gently stroked Emma's cheek with his finger. She grasped it with her tiny hand, and he felt a surge of protective love so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. She will, he promised. I'm going to make sure she faces the full consequences of her actions. The next morning, Ray returned to Margaret's house with a warrant and backup officers. Margaret answered the door in her bathrobe, her face haggard from a sleepless night. Margaret Thompson, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Emma Martinez, breaking and entering and endangering the welfare of a child, Ray announced, his voice steady and professional. Margaret's face crumpled as Ray read her rights. The reality of what she had done and what it would cost her finally hit home. She had destroyed her own life in her quest to destroy Sarah's. As Ray led her to the police car, neighbors began to emerge from their houses. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the community. People who had known Margaret for years stood in shock, unable to believe that someone they knew could poison a baby. Mrs. Chin was among the crowd, tears streaming down her face. How could she do such a thing? She whispered to another neighbor. That poor baby, that poor mother. The trial that followed was one of the most emotionally charged cases the county had seen in years. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, built a methodical case that painted Margaret as a dangerous woman driven by racial hatred and an obsessive need for control. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's fingerprints were on the bottle caps and refrigerator handle. The hand sanitizer found in Emma's milk matched the exact brand and lot number of the bottle found in Margaret's purse. Security cameras from neighboring houses showed Margaret crossing the street at the time of the poisoning and returning an hour later. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Margaret's own history of escalating harassment towards Sarah and her family. The prosecution presented months of documentation: the passive-aggressive notes, the frivolous HOA complaints, the anonymous calls to Child Protective Services, and witness testimony about Margaret's increasingly hostile behavior. Dr. Williams testified about Emma's condition when she arrived at the hospital, describing in clinical detail how close the baby had come to serious injury or death. His testimony was so graphic that several jurors were visibly shaken, and two had to excuse themselves briefly. The amount of isopropyl alcohol in the child's system was significant enough to cause respiratory distress, potential brain damage, and in worst-case scenarios, death, Dr. Williams explained to the jury. If the mother hadn't brought her in when she did, we could have been looking at a very different outcome. Sarah's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She described the morning of the poisoning in excruciating detail, the normalcy of their routine, Emma's trust as she took the bottle, the sudden horror as her daughter began to suffer, and the terrifying hours in the hospital not knowing if Emma would survive. I keep thinking about that moment when I offered her the bottle, Sarah said, her voice breaking. She looked up at me with such complete trust. She believed I would never let anything hurt her. And I failed her. I gave her poison because I trusted my community, because I believed we were safe. Sarah had to pause several times during her testimony as she broke down in tears. The jury watched in silence as this young mother, who had done nothing wrong except try to build a good life for her daughter, described the worst experience of her life. I moved to Maple Grove because I wanted Emma to grow up somewhere safe, Sarah continued. I wanted her to have a yard to play in, neighbors who cared about each other, a community where she could thrive. Instead, I learned that hatred can live behind the prettiest facades, that someone could smile at you while planning to hurt your child. When it was Ray's turn to testify, he struggled to maintain his professional composure. As the investigating detective, he presented the evidence methodically and objectively. But when the prosecutor asked him about the personal impact of the crime, his carefully controlled facade cracked. Your Honor, this case represents everything I became a police officer to fight against, Ray said, his voice steady but his eyes blazing with suppressed emotion. The deliberate targeting of an innocent child because of racial prejudice is not just a crime, it's an attack on everything our community should stand for. Ray described the investigation in detail, walking the jury through each piece of evidence that had led to Margaret's arrest. He explained how the crime scene analysis had revealed the premeditated nature of the attack and how Margaret's own actions had left a clear trail of evidence. The defendant didn't act in a moment of passion or anger, Ray testified. She planned this attack carefully. She waited for the right opportunity, used her knowledge of the family's routine, and deliberately chose to target the most vulnerable member of the household, a 6-month-old baby. Margaret's defense attorney, A public defender named Robert Chin, who had drawn the unenviable task of defending the indefensible, tried to argue that his client had never intended to seriously harm Emma. He portrayed Margaret as a lonely, mentally unstable woman who had made a terrible mistake in judgment. "My client is not a violent person," Chin argued. "She has no history of harming children or animals. This was the act of someone who was not thinking clearly, someone who was overwhelmed by personal problems and made a catastrophic error in judgment." But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. District Attorney Walsh pointed out that Margaret had mixed hand sanitizer into multiple bottles, not just one. She had taken time to carefully blend the poison so it wouldn't be immediately detectable. She had researched Sarah's schedule and planned the attack for maximum impact. "This was not a mistake," Walsh told the jury. "This was attempted murder, planned and executed with cold calculation. The defendant targeted a helpless infant because she couldn't tolerate the sight of a happy, multiracial family in her neighborhood. There is no excuse for what she did, no mitigation that can explain away the deliberate poisoning of a baby." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim with determination. The foreman, a middle-aged father of 3, stood to read the verdict with visible emotion in his voice. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant Margaret Thompson guilty. On the charge of breaking and entering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a child, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty." Margaret collapsed in her chair as each guilty verdict was read. The reality of what she had done, and what it would cost her, finally penetrated the wall of denial she had built around herself. She would spend the next 15 to 25 years in prison, and she would carry the label of child abuser for the rest of her life. During the sentencing phase, Judge Patricia Hernandez delivered a scathing rebuke that would be quoted in legal journals for years to come. "Mrs. Thompson, in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many terrible crimes," Judge Hernandez said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "But I have rarely seen such a calculated attack on innocence, such a deliberate targeting of a helpless child motivated by nothing more than racial hatred and petty jealousy." Judge Hernandez continued, her eyes fixed on Margaret, who sat hunched in her chair, finally understanding the full magnitude of her actions. "You didn't just poison a bottle of milk. You poisoned the sense of safety and community that every family has a right to expect. You turned a home into a crime scene and a neighborhood into a place of fear. You took a mother's most basic trust, that she could feed her child safely, and you shattered it completely." The judge sentenced Margaret to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. "I am imposing the maximum sentence allowed by law because the evidence shows that you planned this attack with meticulous care, that you felt no remorse for your actions, and that you represent a clear and ongoing danger to any community where you might live." As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Sarah one last time. The hatred that had once burned in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow understanding of what she had lost. Instead of the satisfaction she had expected to feel seeing Sarah suffer, Margaret found herself looking at a woman who had shown her nothing but kindness and had responded to her hatred with grace and dignity. Sarah felt no satisfaction in Margaret's downfall. If anything, she felt a deep sadness for the waste of a human life, for the choices that had led Margaret down such a dark path. After the trial, the transformation of the Maple Grove community was remarkable. The neighborhood that had once been divided by Margaret's toxic influence came together in support of Sarah and Emma. A community fund was established not just for medical expenses, but to help Sarah feel safe in her home again. The Martinez house became the unofficial center of neighborhood life. Parents brought their children to play with Emma, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and offers to help, and the elderly residents adopted Sarah as an honorary granddaughter. Mrs. Chin, who had been devastated by her perceived failure to protect Emma, became a permanent fixture in their lives, treating Emma like her own great-grandchild. Ray found himself welcomed into this community in a way he had never expected. His relationship with Sarah evolved into something deeper than their original romance. They became true partners in raising Emma and healing from the trauma they had shared. While they didn't rush back into a romantic relationship, there was an understanding between them that their bond had been forged in crisis and strengthened by love. Emma thrived in this environment of love and protection. She grew from a baby into a toddler surrounded by people who would do anything to keep her safe. She learned to walk in a yard filled with neighbors cheering her on, said her first words to an audience of loving adults, and celebrated every milestone with a community that treasured her. But perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah herself. The young woman who had once felt uncertain about her place in the world found her voice as an advocate for community safety and racial equality. She began speaking at community meetings about the importance of standing up against hatred before it escalates into violence. "We can't wait until someone gets hurt to address the warning signs," Sarah would tell audiences. "Margaret didn't wake up one day and decide to poison my baby. She escalated slowly, and our community enabled her by staying silent about her behavior." Sarah's advocacy work led to new policies in Maple Grove and surrounding communities. HOA boards received training on recognizing and addressing harassment. Neighborhood watch programs were restructured to focus on protecting vulnerable residents rather than excluding them. Police departments implemented new protocols for investigating bias-motivated crimes. 3 years after the poisoning, Emma celebrated her 4th birthday with a party that filled the entire street. Children ran through sprinklers while parents gathered around picnic tables, sharing food and stories. Ray watched from the porch as Emma played with her friends, her laughter bright and carefree. "She has no memory of what happened," Sarah said, joining Ray on the porch steps. "Sometimes I wonder if that's a blessing or if she should know how many people fought to protect her." "She'll know," Ray replied, watching as Mrs. Chen helped Emma blow bubbles that drifted across the yard. "Maybe not the details, but she'll know she's loved. She'll know she's safe. And when she's old enough, she'll understand that sometimes good people have to stand up against hatred to protect what matters most." As the sun set over Maple Grove, casting golden light across the celebration, Sarah reflected on how much their lives had changed. The house that had once felt like a fortress of fear had become a home filled with joy. The neighborhood that had harbored such darkness had learned to shine with the light of genuine community. Emma would grow up knowing that while evil exists in the world, there are always people willing to stand up against it. She would know that her father was a hero who fought for justice, that her mother was a warrior who protected her family, and that true strength comes from love, not hate. And somewhere in a prison cell, Margaret Thompson served her sentence, finally understanding that her hatred had accomplished nothing except the destruction of her own life. The family she had tried to destroy had not only survived but thrived, and the neighborhood she had tried to control had rejected her toxic influence forever. The story of what happened on Maple Grove became more than just a cautionary tale about the dangers of hatred left unchecked. It became a testament to the power of community, the strength of love, and the possibility of healing even after the worst kind of betrayal. In the end, Margaret's plan had backfired completely. Instead of driving Sarah and Emma away, her actions had made them permanent, beloved members of the community. Instead of maintaining her control over the neighborhood, she had lost everything. Instead of destroying a family, she had only made them stronger. The house across the street from where Margaret used to live was now home to a young couple with twin babies. They had heard the story of what happened and had chosen to move to Maple Grove specifically because of how the community had rallied around Sarah and Emma. They knew they were moving somewhere that would protect and cherish their children. Emma's 4th birthday party was winding down as neighbors began to gather up their children and leftover food. But no one seemed in a hurry to leave. This was more than just a birthday party, it was a celebration of everything they had built together, everything they had overcome, and everything they had learned about the true meaning of community. As the last guests said their goodbyes, Emma fell asleep in Ray's arms while Sarah cleaned up the remnants of the party. The yard was littered with deflated balloons and forgotten toys, evidence of a day filled with pure joy and innocence. "I love you both," Ray said quietly, kissing the top of Emma's head and reaching for Sarah's hand. "We love you too," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand and looking around at their beautiful, imperfect, wonderful life. The neighborhood had learned that hatred always comes with a price, but love always wins in the end. Margaret Thompson's attempt to destroy a family had only made them stronger, had only brought a community together in defense of what was right and good and worth protecting. And that was the greatest victory of all. Overcome even the darkest intentions. Years passed, and Emma grew into a bright, confident child who knew nothing but love and acceptance from her community. When she started kindergarten, she was the kind of child who made friends easily, who stood up for others who were being picked on, and who saw the best in everyone she met. On the 5th anniversary of the poisoning, Sarah received an unexpected letter. It was from Margaret, writing from prison. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it, unsure if she was ready to hear from the woman who had tried to kill her daughter. The letter was different from what Sarah had expected. It wasn't defensive or full of excuses. Instead, it was a raw, honest confession of a woman who had finally understood the magnitude of her actions. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I need you to know that not a day passes that I don't think about what I did to your beautiful daughter. I have spent 5 years in therapy, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could hurt an innocent child. I was consumed by hatred and jealousy that I didn't even recognize in myself. I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, but the truth is I was just a bitter, angry woman who couldn't stand to see someone else's happiness. I know I can never undo what I did. I know I destroyed your sense of safety and security. I know I caused Emma pain and put her life in danger. There are no words adequate to express my remorse. I don't expect forgiveness and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that the therapy and reflection have helped me understand that what I did was born from my own pain and inadequacy, not from anything you or Emma did wrong. You were perfect neighbors. You were kind, respectful, and brought joy to the community. I was the problem and I am deeply, truly sorry. Sarah read the letter 3 times before showing it to Ray. They sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where Margaret had once stood poisoning their daughter's bottles, and discussed what the letter meant. "Do you think she's sincere?" Sarah asked. Ray studied the letter carefully. "I think prison and therapy have given her perspective she didn't have before. Whether that makes her truly reformed, I don't know. But I think her remorse is real. Should I write back? That's entirely up to you. You don't owe her anything." Sarah thought about it for weeks. Finally, she decided to write a brief response, not for Margaret's sake but for her own healing. "Margaret," she wrote, "I received your letter. While I cannot say I forgive you, I can say that I no longer carry anger toward you. Emma is thriving, our community is stronger, and we have built a life filled with love and purpose. I hope you can find peace and use your remaining years to help others avoid the path you took. We will not be corresponding further, but I wish you healing." Sending that letter felt like closing a final chapter. Sarah had faced her daughter's attacker with grace and dignity, just as she had faced everything else in her life. Emma was now 7 years old, excelling in school and involved in every community activity imaginable. She played soccer on a team that Ray coached, took piano lessons from Mrs. Chin, and had inherited her mother's compassion for others. One day, Emma came home from school with questions that Sarah had been dreading but knew would eventually come. "Mommy, Kayla's mom said something weird happened to me when I was a baby. Something about a bad lady?" Sarah's heart raced, but she had prepared for this conversation. She sat Emma down in the living room and explained, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes adults make very bad choices that hurt other people. "A long time ago, when you were just a baby, there was a lady in our neighborhood who was very unhappy. Instead of asking for help or trying to feel better, she made a choice to hurt you because she didn't like that Daddy and I were different colors and that we had you." Emma processed this information with the serious expression she wore when thinking through difficult concepts. "Did she go to jail?" "Yes, she did. Daddy helped catch her, and she's in jail where she can't hurt anyone else." "Am I safe now?" "You are very safe. Daddy and I and all our neighbors and your teachers and lots of other people work very hard every day to keep you safe." Emma nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation. Then she asked the question that broke Sarah's heart and made her proud at the same time. "Was the lady sad? Like really sad inside?" Sarah was amazed by her daughter's capacity for empathy, even toward someone who had tried to harm her. "Yes, sweetheart. I think she was very sad and very confused about what would make her feel better. Maybe she needed more hugs," Emma said with the simple wisdom of childhood. That night, Sarah and Ray talked about how remarkable their daughter was, how she had inherited the best qualities of both parents and been shaped by a community that valued kindness above all else. "She's going to change the world," Ray said, watching Emma sleep peacefully in her bed. "She already has," Sarah replied. "She changed ours." The Maple Grove community had indeed been transformed by Emma's story. The neighborhood now hosted annual diversity celebrations, had implemented community garden projects that brought families together, and had become a model for other communities dealing with racial tensions. Sarah's advocacy work had expanded beyond their neighborhood. She spoke at conferences across the country about recognizing and addressing bias before it escalates into violence. Her message was always the same: communities have the power to choose love over hate, inclusion over exclusion, and healing over revenge. Ray had been promoted to detective captain, partly due to his exemplary work on Emma's case, but mostly because his approach to community policing had become a model for other departments. He had learned that true protection comes not from punishment after crimes occur, but from building relationships that prevent crimes from happening in the first place. Mrs. Chin, now in her 80s, had become the unofficial grandmother to half the children in the neighborhood. She taught piano lessons in her living room, organized neighborhood potluck dinners, and served as a bridge between the older residents and the young families who continued to move to Maple Grove specifically because of its reputation for inclusivity and community support. On Emma's 8th birthday, the celebration was bigger than ever. Children from across the community came to play, parents shared stories and laughter, and the entire street was filled with the joy of a community that had learned to choose love over fear. As the party wound down, Sarah found herself standing in the same spot where she used to rock Emma as a baby, the place where this whole story had begun. She thought about Margaret, somewhere in a prison cell, missing out on all the beauty and joy that life could offer when people choose to open their hearts instead of closing them. She thought about the letter Margaret had written, about the therapy and self-reflection that had finally allowed her to see the truth about her actions. Sarah hoped that Margaret would use her remaining years to warn others about the dangers of unchecked hatred, to help prevent other families from experiencing what they had endured. But mostly, Sarah thought about Emma, now running through the yard with her friends, her laughter bright and uninhibited. This child, who had survived an attack motivated by pure hatred, had grown up to be a beacon of love and acceptance. She was living proof that love really does triumph over hate, that communities really can heal, and that even the darkest chapters can have endings filled with light. As the sun set over Maple Grove for another peaceful evening, Sarah gathered Emma into her arms for their nightly ritual. "Tell me about your day, sweetheart," Sarah said, settling into the rocking chair where she had fed Emma that poison bottle so many years ago. "It was perfect, Mommy. All my friends came and Mrs. Chun played piano, and Daddy taught us a new game and everyone was happy." "What made it perfect?" Emma thought for a moment, then smiled the radiant smile that had charmed everyone she met since birth. "Because everyone I love was together and no one was sad or angry or mean. It was just perfect." Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and birthday cake in her hair, and whispered the same words she had spoken every night since bringing Emma home from the hospital. "You are loved, little one. You are safe and you are loved." And in that moment, surrounded by the warm sounds of their community settling in for the evening, Sarah knew that love had indeed won. Not just in their case but in the way their story had rippled out to touch other lives, other communities, other families who needed to know that hatred doesn't have to have the last word. Emma would grow up knowing that while evil exists in the world, there are always people willing to stand up against it. She would know that her parents were heroes who fought for justice and healing, that her community was a family that chose to protect rather than exclude, and that true strength comes from love, not hate. The house that had once been the site of such darkness was now filled with light, laughter, and the promise of a future where children like Emma could grow up safe in the knowledge that they are cherished exactly as they are. And that truly was the greatest victory of all.